And you're back to the Ecocentric. I'm Suzy Hamilton, your host for today's show. How much of a sea change would it take to restore our dammed rivers? And what if we started cracking down on deadbeat dams? That's the premise of an award-winning American film that the Eco-Society is showing at the Civic on September 10th. It's called Dam Nation, and it tackles a topic that seemed totally ridiculous 20 years ago. And now, well, you need to see the film on September 10th. But here in BC, we're not talking about removing dams. We're actually talking about building them, and big ones at that, on the Peace River. And this is no deadbeat dam. I've reached the publisher of the Common Sense Canadian, Damien Gillis, to tell us more about our hydroelectrical future. Hi, Damien.
Well, it's great to be on your show, Suzy. It's been a few years.
It sure has. Well, this award-winning documentary that's coming to the Civic on September 10th is all about restoring rivers and removing dams, yet here we are in BC about to build a monstrosity on the Peace River that hardly reflects this kind of thinking, and you've been writing and researching BC energy policy for a number of years. What's the latest on the Site C Dam proposal?
Well, the latest is it's gone through the joint review panel hearing over the last year, started about Christmas time last year, and that panel made its recommendations under the revised environmental review regulations in Canada. Panels that are reviewing projects no longer make the decision. They simply refer a certain recommendation to in this case, the federal cabinet, and they're set to make their decision on the project sometime this fall, most likely late September, early October from the latest I'm hearing. And throughout that process, the panel heard many troubling things about this proposal, a couple of which, I think one of them is the inherent food security value of this remarkable farmland. BC Hydro, the proponent, has gone out of its way to really downplay the agricultural value of that land. But as the panel heard from two of the country's top independent agrologists, Wendy Holm and Evelyn Wolterson, in fact, it contains some of the best soils in Canada. It has a very particular, unique climatic characteristics that make it some of the best farmland that we have, and could potentially put into full use, could feed up to 1 million people. Now, we have a real food security challenge in BC. We grow less than half of the food we consume today. We rely on imports from places like California, which are now undergoing historic droughts, and that's affecting their agricultural production. So what we're doing here essentially is trading food that we do need for energy that we don't. And the reason we can say that is that we're actually self-sufficient in this province today when it comes to electricity into the long-term foreseeable future. We brought a lot of smaller dams called euphemistically independent power projects or run-of-river projects, many of which have turned out to have far greater impacts on fish and the environment than the government and companies initially projected. And this is something that my colleague, former Environment Minister Rafe Mayer, and I have been warning about for years, about that program too, the private power program. And so we've also done a very good job with conservation in this province. And that means that we're in a position where we actually don't need to be damming up any more rivers and impacting our food security and our fish and wildlife values. But there is a tremendous push to do this, both through more of these quote-unquote smaller projects and building this massive dam, which has a price tag initially of $8 billion, but I think we can expect that to be far greater than that in the long run, as we see with the track record of this government managing other capital projects. Dams are notorious for going over budget, and we're already seeing the results in terms of skyrocketing power bills for consumers, and we're taking huge ecological risks here that, in my view, are totally unnecessary.
What are they going to use this power for, then, if we've done such a good job on conserving?
Well, that's another thing that came out of this hearing. They've actually changed their story now. There have been three completely different justifications that have been given for this dam, which has been on the books for over 30 years now. I should mention, too, my family, I've been particularly interested in this issue. My family has settled in the Peace River Valley, a little west of the proposed Site C Dam, and we'd farmed that land for over 50 years when it was flooded in 1968 to build the first dam up there, Bennett Dam. Mm-hmm. Subsequently, there was another dam, Peace Canyon, just west of that. Now, this would be the third in the Peace Valley, and it's been planned as such, and that's why it's referred to as Site C, as the third in a series of three dams for a long time, and is always been dire warnings about BC running out of power, and if we didn't build this, there would be brownouts. That happened in the 80s. The project was scuttled for financial reasons, and these concerns came and went. And BC Hydro has a long history of drastically over-projecting, often in the region of 30% or more, our future power needs, and they're back at it again. I think there's a tremendous institutional desire to see this last major project built, because places like California and other jurisdictions are clearly closing the door on big dams and even going the opposite direction, as you've illustrated. So this is kind of the last big project that they've sort of been pre-approved to do. But the answers that we're getting today, so it's clearly not for our homes and businesses. We're self-sufficient there. We were then told that it was necessary to power this massive and energy-intensive liquefied natural gas program that the government has made the centerpiece of its election policy and continues to harp on. And converting gas to liquid in order to put it on tankers requires enormous amounts of energy. You have to chill it to minus 160 degrees. And so initially the thinking was that Site C could be used to help power that with subsidized public power. We now see that the amount of power this dam would generate, even at 1,000 megawatts, would barely power one of the dozen or more plants that have been proposed. So it doesn't really appear that BC Hydro has any serious way of addressing those LNG demands, even with this dam. The other reason that emerged from recent hearings that kind of came out of the blue was the idea of exporting power to California, as they are facing water shortages in their own hydroelectric system and tearing down some of their dams. Some people had the bright idea at BC Hydro that we can start supplying the California market with more BC power. The irony is, of course, that in doing so, we're flooding our own farmland, and for the very same reasons, California is being affected in terms of agriculture production, which we currently depend on for many of our imports. So, again, the whole situation doesn't make a lot of sense, especially when you hear the story change over and over again. It starts to really wear down the credibility of the project.
Well, what if the project is given the green light? What can we as citizens and voters do at that point? Is it a done deal then?
Well, first of all, I would suggest that this is a very critical moment where the decision has not been made. And so sending letters and emails to the federal cabinet before they make this decision over the next month, this is a really opportune time. And we have seen instances where the BC government has pre-approved projects, like Taseko Mine's proposed Prosperity Mine, west of Williams Lake. Twice the BC government issued it, environmental approvals, and twice the federal cabinet declined the project. And so there have been situations like in the past. I don't think the federal government has a lot of skin in this game, and certainly the panel, while they didn't recommend in favor or against the project, they raised some very serious concerns. And I think this is actually a great window of opportunity to email your local MPs in that region, conservative MPs particularly, and the federal cabinet, and tell them that this isn't a good deal for you as a taxpayer or a BC Hydro ratepayer. You're going to have to bear the burden. BC Hydro already has $70 billion of debts and obligations, which are drastically driving up our power bills into the future. You're going to pile potentially $10 billion or more from this dam, but also we don't need the power. It's not for us, and we're going to pay a very serious cost in terms of the ecology and the farmland. I think even if federal cabinet does approve it, you could see a similar situation with the Enbridge pipeline today, where particularly First Nations, Treaty 8 First Nations, who feel their treaty rights are being grossly violated by this project and the lack of due consultation that they've received around it, they've made their views clear, and we could very much expect to see litigation and other things that could slow this project down. Not to mention the fact that this government has run up our debt and run up these obligations through BC Hydro to such levels that you see it can't afford to pay teachers or put more teachers in the classrooms right now. And they say, where's the money going to come from? Well, this is a problem of their own making in terms of mismanaging our fiscal situation over the last 13 years. And this Site C dam would just be the straw that breaks the camel's back. So there are many reasons why this project shouldn't be built, and I do think there's a tremendous amount of vulnerability, both financially and in terms of the environmental issues and First Nations concerns as well.
Would the panel want to see that there's some sort of stability in the LNG market, which it sounds like is kind of not so stable right now?
Well, I think the panel rightly questioned some of the motivation here and the fact that the story did change to some degree, and absolutely they did ultimately feel that it was economically justified, but they weren't very specific about that, and there were serious questions raised there. I completely agree with the implication of your question, which is that this powering LNG or building this $10 billion plus taxpayer investment solely to subsidize the yet to be built LNG industry that appears to be on very shaky ground right now doesn't make a lot of sense. This dam wouldn't even be up and running until probably 2022 at least. We're supposed to be entering the LNG market in this great race that we're in with other competitors to access these rapidly plunging Asian prices for LNG, and that's supposed to happen well before the dam would even be complete. In Hydro's draft integrated resource plan last year, which is kind of their blueprint for power mapping in the coming years, they really seemed very confused about LNG, like this had been foisted on them from the government. They've been told, deal with LNG, work it into your model somehow, and they kind of put their hands up and said, well, I guess we can budget maybe 6% of our total production in a year. But that's not even enough to power one of the larger plants here. So they don't really seem to, even with Site C, to have any kind of idea how to supply that industry. Industry itself has indicated it's much cheaper for it to just burn some of its gas to make power. We changed our climate laws, which said we couldn't build any new gas-fired electric plants in BC for climate reasons, justifiably. And we even changed those laws and made it okay for companies in Kootenay or Prince Rupert to burn gas to power this process. So there doesn't really seem to be any justification there, and that may explain why the story changed again to, let's take some of the surplus power and sell it to California, which is highly problematic. We've run into trouble in that before, to a major multi-$100 million judgment against BC taxpayers just last year over fraudulent power sales we were engaged with to California in the early 2000s.
Well, Damien, we are going to have to leave it there. It's fascinating, and I hope that the minute that this announcement is made, we can get back in touch with you and get your take on what's going to happen next.
Well, that'd be great. And again, I encourage your readers, go to commonsensecanadian.ca, our website, and you can stay up to date on the issue.
Okay.
And don't wait till after the announcement is made, because now's the time when Cabinet needs to hear from your listeners before they commit to building this dam.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time to talk with us today. We'll talk again.
My pleasure.
Okay.
Thanks, Suzy.
Bye for now. And that was Common Sense Canadian publisher Damien Gillis.